Welcome to another episode of the Ivy Podcast. Today, I'm super excited about hosting Frank Cespedes, who is the Harvard Business School professor and an author of multiple books, most recently, The Sales Management That Works. I'm very excited about this conversation. Frank, thank you so much for making time. Join us on the Ivy Podcast today.
John, it is my pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting me.
Great. Well, before we dive in and talk about all the great things and insights you share in your book, tell us a little bit more about your career, your background, maybe a thumbnail version of that.
Well, I don't have a particularly exotic background. You know, I got my doctorate. I then joined the Harvard Business School faculty. I was a marketing professor. And my research as a professor always concerned sales, distribution, other go-to-market issues. I made my way up the hierarchy, and then after 10 years, I left academia and with some others started a business, ran it for 10 years, and got lucky. I could spin this a different way, John, if you like, but it was dumb luck. We sold at exactly the right time. Harvard called me up and said, how'd you like to come back and be a professor again? And I said, yes. I've taught strategy, the startup course, and I began courses on entrepreneurial sales and marketing. And I can tell you that 10 years running a business increases your interest and respect for sales in particular.
Right, absolutely. What an exciting career. Thank you for sharing those insights. And I'm a big fan in terms of the mantra that coming from a highly technical background myself, I was always in the build mode. I was always all about developing the skills as a builder. But halfway through the journey as well, I did realize that if you can build, you're great. If you can sell, you're greater. But if you can do both, you become unstoppable. So for me, an obsession also becomes to develop those complementary skills in terms of business development, sales. And when an opportunity came about to talk to you a little bit further, especially about the insights that you share in your book, Sales Management That Works, can you first tell us a little bit more about the motivation behind writing this book and who can benefit most from some of the insights that you share?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair question because it's not as though the world is waiting breathlessly for yet another book about sales. In fact, if you go to Amazon and go to the book section and put sales in the keyword space, out will come over 80,000 stock keeping units. Far as I can tell, the only management topic that gets more SKUs at Amazon is, quote, leadership. Gets about 90,000, but sales is a close second. You may know the old aphorism, no single drop of rain ever feels responsible for the flood. So good question. Why did I contribute to this tsunami? Basically, I had two motivations. The first is fundamentally an intellectual, professional motivation. Of all the business functions, sales is by far the most context specific. Selling software is different than selling capital goods, is different than selling professional services. Selling 5, 6, 7-year license software is different than selling so-called SaaS, right? Software as a service. It also varies depending upon to whom and where you're selling. The fact is, selling in North America is different than selling in Latin America, Europe, Middle East, Asia, etc. Very context specific. Yet sales is also that area where for some reason people feel most comfortable making huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any data beyond what in academia we would call N equals 1. When I sold for Oracle, when we invested in PayPal, that kind of stuff. So as somebody who's looked at this topic and done a lot of research in it for 30 years and ran a business, I wanted to write a book that says, look, this is what research does and does not tell you about this core activity. And I also think, and this was my second motivation, I think it's a particularly good time for a book like this. there is no doubt whatsoever that technology and the sustained data revolution, which will continue throughout our lifetimes, there's no doubt that that is affecting buying and selling. But again, my reading of what people say about online technologies and data simply does not reflect managerial reality, especially in the sales area. And I think the pandemic has raised the stakes for getting this right. So again, I thought it was an important topic, and in the current situation, a very timely topic.
Right, absolutely. And I don't want to beat a dead horse when we talk about pre-pandemic, pandemic, post-pandemic things, but you share insights for companies that, to define their post-pandemic channel strategies. What are some of the key components of an effective post-pandemic channel strategy that you see a lot of successful companies implement versus those that make a great attempt but not, are not able to move the needle?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the first thing I would say about that, in answer to that question, John, and I've learned that what I'm about to say is good advice about business in general. First, take out the garbage. First, get rid of the waste. And when it comes to a post-pandemic channel or sales strategy, especially if you're in a tech business, be very, very wary of these many glib new normal predictions that we've been hearing for the last 18 months and that we hear weekly. For example, it is not a digital eats physical world. That is simply untrue. Let me give you an example. I'm going to use the United States market and economy as an example. I hope you would agree with me. The United States is a reasonably well-developed nation. Some people would say we invented the internet. It's been around over 30 years. E-commerce has been part of the internet since its inception. Books.com was selling books online nationwide while Jeff Bezos was still working for a hedge fund. All right, so it's been here. Here's the data. Take a guess. Just before the pandemic, the beginning of 2020, what was e-commerce as a percentage of total US retail sales? And in e-commerce, include Amazon, include people who may purchase online but pay in the store or vice versa. What do you think that percentage was? Take a guess. You won't get a grade, I promise.
Around 10%?
How much?
Around 10%?
Very good. Very good. The actual answer is 11.1%. But when I ask most executives to guess what that number is, I typically get estimates from 30 to 60%. In other words, wow, they're not just a little bit off, they're orders of magnitude off. Good. Now, what's happened during the pandemic? Obviously, or at least it seems obvious to me, when stores are closed or when they're held to 25 to 50% of their capacity, and when people legitimately feel that if they go into a store, they may catch a virus and die, obviously there's going to be more buying and selling online. But here the relevant data is the second quarter of last year, second quarter of 2020. E-commerce as a percentage of total US retail sales, 15%. In other words, even in maximum lockdown conditions, it went up only about 5%, and it has been trending down every quarter since. It is not a digital eats physical world, but that doesn't mean that online technology is not a big deal. It has changed buying, and it has been changing buying for at least the last 10 years. It's now an omni-channel buying world that affects sales, sales management, and business development requirements. And it affects those requirements in all the core areas: people, process, pricing, performance management, and so forth. So that's my first advice. Make sure you check your assumptions. And as I said, be be very, very skeptical about all these predictions that it's all about virtual selling. It's all about this. The reality, online and offline, in the vast majority of markets, are complements, not substitutes.
Good portion of our listeners on Ivy Podcast are executives, whether technology, finance, operations, Fortune 500 companies to smaller startups, different sectors. In terms of, I would love to hear your perspectives on the alignment of the strategy and sales for executives. You've shared some very interesting stats in terms of the executives when we talk about, as an example of e-commerce penetration and then being completely off. Those are definitely very interesting observations. What are some of the most common pitfalls that you see executives fall into when we talk about alignment of the strategy and sales?
Yeah, no, excellent question, because again, I wrote my previous book was called Aligning Strategy and Sales. I run an executive program on that topic at Harvard, and it's a growing issue. You mentioned some of the data in my current book, and I think it's worth very quickly reviewing it for our listeners. If you look at the global 1,200, the 1,200 biggest companies in the world, over the last 25 years, on average, the number of executives reporting to the CEO of those companies has doubled, twice as many.
Wow.
But then if you ask yourself, well, who are these people? What were they doing before they became senior executives? The reality is that relatively few of them were general managers in the sense in which we use that phrase at Harvard Business School. There, we typically, by a general manager, we typically mean somebody who's running a line of business or has P&L responsibility. The majority of these C-level executives are specialists: the CMO, the head of data analytics, legal, regulatory, so forth. Now, why is that? It's not as though companies wake up and say, oh boy, let's be bureaucratic and siloed. That's not why. The world is more complex. We are living through a data revolution. Being a marketer today is more complex than it was even 10, 15 years ago. The same is true with sales, finance, etc. But the reality is that fewer people than ever before have made it to the C-suite without prolonged prior experience in customer contact. In fact, Heidrick and Struggles, which for decades has published an annual, road to the top report, tells you where, the CEO came from. About 2-3 years ago, they stopped breaking out marketing and sales as a separate category because there are relatively few of these people. They're mainly coming from finance and engineering. All right. Now, that's a big deal, because one of the core requirements of any senior executive is to help formulate and implement a market relevant strategy. And if you really are out of touch with what's going on in your sales model, it's very, very difficult to do that. Very difficult. And I sit on a number of boards, and I can tell you many senior executives don't know the questions to ask about their sales model. So it's a big issue, and it's a growing issue. What do you do to align strategy and sales? Well, you always begin first with the externals. The most important thing about selling in any business is the buyer, not the seller. Who buys, why, and how. You begin with the external market because that is where value is ultimately created or destroyed. It's not created or destroyed in a meeting. It's not created or destroyed in product development. It's created or destroyed out there in the marketplace. So what is going on in our market, and what is our strategy? If we have a strategy, we're making choices about who is our customer and who is not our customer. Those things ultimately determine the sales tasks. And by sales tasks, I mean, what is it that our business development people need to be very good at as opposed to what marketing can do, or customer success, or operations, or whatever. Then the key issue in aligning strategy and sales is getting our actual selling behaviors to link with those important tasks. And ultimately, managers have three levers to do that. The first and usually most important one is people. Who do we hire? What do we do with them once we hire them? How do we train, develop, socialize them? The second lever is our performance management systems. How do we pay them? Do we take performance reviews seriously, et cetera? And then the third is the wider company environment in which sales operates. What's the nature of the communication, if any, between sales and other functions? Who do we hire and promote as sales leaders? So that would be the advice I would give in answer to your question, but it's a good question about a very big issue that simply does not get enough attention.
And I realize how loaded of a question that is, and I appreciate you being so very concise and compartmentalizing some of these areas, having spent the last several years in enterprise sales. The big, one of the major discoveries for me, at least personally, in terms of successful sales that I was able to execute are all, it starts with a relationship. It's a contact sport. It's being able to build that rapport, that relationship with a particular individual who can then open the necessary doors for you within the organization. And you've mentioned talent as well. So to double click on that, connecting talent with the sales strategy and innovation, developing highly talented teams and a strong culture with the passion for winning while treating each other the right way adds another element of complexity to this. How can executives adapt their processes, especially in the post-pandemic environment, to really succeed in not only sales, but also building a winning culture simultaneously?
Yeah, well, again, it always begins with people. And I think your learning from enterprise sales applies not just in B2B enterprise sales, but in consumer sales. We've gone through the data about e-commerce. Selling has always, for thousands of years, selling and buying have always been social as well as economic transactions. And I don't think a once in a century pandemic is going to change that. So people count. Because it begins with people, I think in turn, in sales in particular, it begins with hiring, all right? And here I think it's important to recognize that hiring in sales presents challenges that simply do not exist to the same extent in other business functions. I mean, for example, if you want to hire an engineer, you can go to a school and it's a little bit like walking into a food court, right? What are you interested in? Electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering. If you want to hire someone in finance or accounting, you can find people who majored in that subject. The same is true with computer programmers. But the last time I looked, which was a little bit over 3 years ago when I started writing this book, of the basically 5,000 colleges and universities in America, less than 300 even offered a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is an area of business where the vast majority of people start out knowing very, very little about what they're going to get paid for. And that in turn leads to my next bit of data. Companies already out of necessity spend a ton of money on training sales, right? They spend 20% more per capita on sales training than any other area of the firm. But the return on that investment is notoriously disappointing. And there are some systemic reasons for that. The other thing I would say is that common hiring practices in sales make what is already a tough job unnecessarily harder. For example, there's a huge over-reliance on unstructured interviews in hiring in sales, all right? You may laugh at this, but I'll give you a good example of why this doesn't work. In my MBA course at Harvard, I do a sales hiring exercise, but it's not simply a theoretical exercise. I bring in salespeople from the Boston area. The MBAs get their LinkedIn resumes, and they've got to hire for two positions that we've already discussed in case studies. So they know about the business, the sales tasks, et cetera. One is an inside sales position. The other is a B2B enterprise sales position. And then they interview the various people, then we debrief. And the first thing I always hear from the students, always when we debrief, is, wow, people who sell for a living are good at interviews. Who knew? Of course they are. And that, by the way, is the single most important lesson of the exercise. You're not hiring the interview portion of the person. Sales is about behavior. It's about what someone actually does on the job. That's who you need to hire. And the data about this is overwhelming. Managers, especially I might add tech founders, in my experience, vastly overestimate their ability to judge somebody's fit on the basis of a few interviews. The correlation between the evaluations people get in interviews and their actual subsequent performance tends to vary from 0.2 to 0.4. In other words, even in the best of circumstances, it's less than the 50-50 rate of flipping a coin. Now, I have colleagues in academia who are very much aware of that research, which goes back over 50 years, and their advice is, therefore, don't interview. Well, I disagree. I think only someone who's never run a business can seriously suggest that. Of course you interview. People hire people. People have to work with people, especially in sales. But you have to augment interviews with other things that allow you to observe behavior. That can be assessments, role plays, but it should also be, in effect, internship hiring scenarios where you can actually observe someone's behavior on the job. Then my last question, sales is an area where talent really counts. Individual performance in sales is very, very wide. Typically, the top 10 to 20% of salespeople in a sales organization are not just a little bit better than the average rep, they're usually 300 to 400% better in terms of sales outcomes. So this is an area where talent counts, and therefore you want to attract talent and retain it. And that's a two-way street. One part of the street is this person a good fit for selling our product in our market at our prices? And the other is any organization and manager has to be worthy of good talent. One of the oldest HR aphorisms is true. People join companies, but they leave managers. So perhaps long-winded way, John, of getting at your question, but it's a good question.
No, I love it. I love it. And you couldn't have set me up any better for the further point that I would love to get your thoughts on, is in this extremely highly competitive market, especially these days, more specifically in technology, because selfishly, that's the space that I play in. The war for talent, the war on retention is real out there. And you briefly mentioned some of the insights in terms of companies succeeding in the space of really being able to attract the top talent, but also to retain it. Speak a little bit further from a standpoint of the company's strategies to be able to succeed in this space, to attract the top performers, especially when it comes to sales, and then retain them as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, it's what I said a little bit earlier. When you're in a tough labor market, and that's what we are in now, although, by the way, that won't last. This will even out over time. But, you're going to do out of necessity what most of your competitors are doing. You're going to pay more, you're going to offer benefits, et cetera. But let me tell you what I think is the real lever here. The real lever is to make sure you know what kind of talent you're seeking. Let me give you an example, because I can, I sit on lots of boards and advisory boards, and I'm usually the person that gets asked, well, now we're going to hire lots of people. You're supposed to know something about that. When I ask, what is it we're looking for in sales and business development, I very, very often get an answer where, quite honestly, only the great, Michael Jordan or Michelangelo could fulfill those criteria. We're looking for some Renaissance man or woman. And my response is always the same. Whenever you can hire Michelangelo or Michael Jordan, do it. I'm sure they'll be great. But the reality is there are very, very few Renaissance men and women out there. And what many companies neglect are the levers available to them to make not the most outstanding talent. Everybody's after that. But in most sales organizations, the real productivity improvements are getting those people in the middle of the bell curve, the average performer, to incrementally improve their performance. In the aggregate, that usually has the biggest impact on the bottom line. Now, the issue is, how do we craft the sales job so that the average performer can do well? And there are levers available to us. Again, do we understand our sales tasks? Are we asking people to do everything? Or are we saying marketing can do this, service can do that? Second, deployment. How do we allocate our available sales talent in such a way that we're not trying to put the square peg in the round hole? We're putting them in areas where, in fact, what they are good at counts. And then the third thing, I think, and this is an area where technology can and should be the seller's friend if the seller knows what he or she is doing. You know this, John. The basic rule about technology still remains: garbage in, garbage out. All right? They're just tools. And here, I think, there's a lot of tech available that can help, when properly used, at increasing the productivity of the average salesperson. I'll give you an example. If you ask yourself, how much time does the average salesperson spend in customer contact? And by customer contact, I don't simply mean making a pitch, either in person or virtually. I mean all forms of customer contact. That, email, demos, webinars, etc. The data obviously varies by company, but in the aggregate, on average, it's about 30 to 35%. Now, think about the impact in your company and most others if we can make that 40%, 45%, nirvana, 50% or more. Not only is that a very big productivity increase, but especially in tech ventures, it increases the total addressable market, because segments that were uneconomic to reach become economically feasible with better sales utilization. And there's a lot of technology that can help with that if we know what we're doing, if we've analyzed the buying situation in our market correctly, and therefore what the sales tasks are. So again, those would be the things I'd point to in answer to your question.
No, I love that. Those are definitely very great examples. And you've mentioned briefly about your exercise that you do with some of the companies that you advise on, especially when it comes to attracting the top talent, and some of them struggling, being able to, identify, yeah, we need the Michael Jordan of our industry. What I've also found from personal experience is that, especially when it comes to interviewing, that there's too much emphasis on what are the weaknesses that we can tolerate in that particular candidate, versus clearly identifying what are the strengths that are missing on our team and try to focus on those, which would then lead hopefully to better results, a better batting average when it comes to interviewing and selecting the candidates. Those are just some of the kind of the nuances that I've been pondering about in especially in this super very competitive market. So thank you for sharing that. Frank, the last segment of each episode, it's a rapid fire rounds, kind of a quick question, quick answer type of segment. Does that sound all right with you?
Yep. Yep.
As far as your personal content diet, aside from books, what are your sources for learning?
Well, books, let's not neglect books. There's still a great technology, and I always have been and continue to be a pretty voracious reader. So that's a big part of the content. Teaching, I've been blessed for many years now, teaching in a pretty good business school with smart people. IQ is not the scarce resource with our students. And then, I sit on boards, I do a lot of consulting, and not only is that learning, but I get paid to learn. And let me tell you, that's nice work if you can get it.
Right. No, that's great. Absolutely. An advice or maybe series of advice that you had received early in your career that you still carry with you and share with others, what would that be?
I think back to something an executive said to me in one of the very, very first case studies that I ever developed at Harvard. This goes back almost 30 years now. Believe me, I looked and smelled like an academic at that point in my career. And I may have been asking this executive naive questions, but at one point he said to me, Frank, watch what you're going to find out during your career. And I think I'm quoting pretty much as he said it. He said, most companies manage marketing and sales as it should have been managed in that industry 5, 6, 7 years in the past. Why? Because that's the last time that the senior people who are making the really important resource allocation decisions in the organization, that's the last time the senior people were out in the field with ongoing customer contact. And so they're making decisions now based on what they saw 5 years ago. And meanwhile, the market is going on. I have discovered over the years that he was pointing to a very, very common phenomenon. And I'd point out, by the way, that's how companies get disrupted.
Oh, that's very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. You're a very successful, highly accomplished individual yourself, but who is your mentor? Someone who inspires you, someone you admire, and why is that?
Well, my mentor for years, he passed away just a few years ago, was actually the fellow who hired me at HBS, a man named Theodore Levitt, Ted Levitt, who in his day was very, very well known. He coined the term marketing myopia. He taught generations of students and executives the way Ted would phrase it. People don't buy 2-inch drill bits, they buy 2-inch holes. In other words, they buy outcomes, not the tools. Ted was my mentor for years, and in many ways still is. I still go back to books he wrote decades ago. And if you change the examples, so much of what Ted had to say about marketing, sales, innovation, those were really his topics, still holds up. So I point to Ted Levitt, who unfortunately, as I say, is now deceased, but lives on through his teaching.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Besides sales management that works, which we're all super excited about getting our hands on it and bring some more from some of the insights that you had shared with us today, book that you always recommend to others, or maybe several books, what are those and why do you recommend them?
Let me cite a few. All right.
Yep.
I'm going to talk about a book that I typically recommend, especially to new sales managers. And then I read 2 good books recently that are just published that I recommend. The book I recommend most often is a book by a colleague of mine. Her name is Linda Hill. And it's a book called Becoming a Manager. And it is quite rightly a classic. Something tells me, John, that you may have had Linda in one of the programs.
I'm looking at my bookshelf right now to try to pull it up.
Well, it's a great book, and our listeners should know what it's about. It's now, I don't know, it's 3rd or 4th edition. It deserves it. But what Linda looks at is the transition in a career from being the individual contributor to the manager. A manager, by definition, has to get things done through others. That is a tough transition in any area, but it's especially tough in sales. I mean, most salespeople are born individual contributors, and that's why they went into sales. They went into sales for the autonomy. If I make my numbers, they leave me alone. But once they become managers, it's a whole different story. And I think Linda's book is by far the best thing written about that crucial transition. The other books I'd recommend are two books that I recently read. One of them is by a person named Bobby Duffy, who teaches at King's College in London. It's called Generations. There's a lot of nonsense, and I mean a lot of nonsense, that you hear daily about, millennials, Generation X, Y, Z. Duffy has data, and I highly recommend this to folks. Think about fintech firms who somehow believe that anybody less than 30 is never going to write a check. They're only going to be online. Read Duffy's book. There's data there. And then the other book, coincidentally also by someone who teaches in London, is by a fellow named Stuart Ritchie. It's called Science Fictions. And the book is about what in science is called the replicability crisis, the fact that there's so many things that get headlines that when you try to do it again, it doesn't work out, all right? But Ritchie's book is also, among other things, one of the best books I have read about how to analyze and interpret data. And that is increasingly important in sales. It's becoming a much more data intensive activity. And this book, I think, as well as being really interesting about science in general, is a good tutorial in some basics about that. So that's my reading list, John.
Well, that's a powerful list, especially, Professor Linda Hill's book. I'm definitely a huge fan, having been part of the program as well, where she taught several lectures. So definitely that's
She's good.
Recommendation. And for our listeners, we'll make all of those titles available in the show notes so that you guys can check it out. Frank, last but not least, whom would you recommend I interview on the podcast next, and why? The reason I asked that question is because out of 280 episodes that we had recorded so far, 280 have been through recommendations as such.
Well, I'll give you a couple. Linda Hill, if Linda's available, interview her. I'll mention someone else. This is a former colleague of mine. His name is Talis Teixeira. And he wrote a book, I think it's 2, maybe 3 years ago, called Unlocking the Customer Value Chain. And what Talis, I think, demonstrates very, very persuasively is that when you look at businesses that have been disrupted in the 21st century, and he's talking about all the businesses we typically cite here, Airbnb, Uber, et cetera. It's not because of the technology. The technology was no big deal and it was available to others. It's because of the business model and how, in his jargon, they unlocked value for customers that was more or less hidden. I think he has a very persuasive analysis, Talis Teixeira.
Oh, that's great. I definitely appreciate those recommendations, Frank, and everything that you had shared with us in this very short and insightful conversation. What I love doing with all of the guests on the Ivy podcast is do a follow-up recording in about a year where we revisit the conversation from a year ago and see if everything that we have discussed still makes sense, still applies. So I'm definitely looking forward to doing that with you as well.
I would look forward to that as well. And again, John, I want to thank you very, very much for hosting me. Let me suggest that, as well as the books I mentioned, I hope people will go out and read mine and give me feedback. I have learned over the years that's the best way to improve.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Frank.